Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks.
We're on air. That means people can now, we welcome those that are listening who may be at home or in their office, so welcome to you as well. So please be seated. Thank you. Can I, first of all, before we officially start, is just to make a statement that, as you'd be aware, that Ray Shipp passed away this past week. So Ray was a dedicated, lifelong politician and businessman, having served the City of Launceston Council for 26 years and an independent MLC in Launceston for 24 years. During his time on council, Ray was hardworking, diligent and always fought for the interest of the ratepayers and the wider community. He was always extremely supportive of council staff and the other elected representatives around the table. Incredibly, Ray served on the council up until the age of 85. Such was his love for the city and his dedication to the job, which included a term as Deputy Mayor to the late John Lees. He had a particular interest in road safety through his driving school and through York Park, very much interested in the development. I say York Park because that's what it was called when he started and was involved, and he was involved in the original committee, and he was very much involved with the setup of the precinct and working forward for the development of the York Park precinct. So on behalf of all the councillors and the City of Launceston, I'd like to offer our deepest sympathies to Ray's wife, Gay, his children and his family at this time. Thank you. Just as we open the meeting, I have three apologies. Councillors Mackenzie, Councillor Dawkins and Councillor Stojanczyk. Any declaration of interest? No. Confirmation of minutes. Somebody happy to move the minutes of the meeting held 17th October. Deputy Mayor, thank you. Councillor Harris, seconded. All those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all the councillors present. There's no deputations and no petitions. So community reports. reports. Very pleased to see Jenny Chapman here, Chair of the QV Mag Arts Foundation. So Jenny, now's your chance to give us a report on the QV Mag Arts Foundation. Thank you. You have the microphone. Thank you.
I acknowledge the Mayor and obviously the councillors as well, but thank you for asking me here today. First, a little bit about my background. Professionally, I've worked in the arts and also heritage management, but I also have, through my working life, done other things, including volunteering. Initially with Blooming Tasmania for 10 years, and now we have the major event at the Albert Hall in Launceston as a result of a committee working towards that. I've also sat on the Friends Committee at QV Mag for 5 years and now 4 years on the foundation of QV Mag and also the chair. During that time, I've got to know how the two entities work within QV Mag, and with the retirement of Keith Adkins as chair, I was fortunate to be nominated. During the course of the last year as chair, we've looked at our constitution and we've become aware of the fact that we need to allow for generational change. We've got to build a structure that is sustainable into the future. And so of late we have modified or amended our constitution to include incoming financial members. And that was announced at the AGM in September. There was also the existence of the Herbert Scott Society, an associated society affiliated with the foundation, and those members have transgressed across to be inaugural members of the foundation. Strength is the key. The business model is very important, of course, and we realised that we needed to roll into the program a series of events and reasons for people to come to QV Mag and to donate, whether it be for bequests or acquisitions or for conservation. Primarily, we are decorative and fine arts, less so the natural sciences. And so I can see that between the two models of the Friends and the Foundation, we each have a different calling. And we have developed in the last year a memorandum of understanding with one particular bequest, which is ongoing and will be a substantial amount of money. We've also included, and with the Masterpiece program, which actually started in 2012, highlighting a major work of a national standing but with a Tasmanian relevance, that become part of the program. And so with the announcement in the last year of the Ben Quilty acquisition, we have raised funds and just recently paid in full back to council for that particular work. We have a foundation dinner scheduled in November, which is on Friday the 15th. And once again, we have engaged a guest speaker relevant to the arts, Karen Quinlan, who was the former director of the Bendigo Art Gallery. We can see synergies between Bendigo Art Gallery and Bendigo Council and how that institution was run. Equally, we can see synergies as how QV Mag Arts Foundation exists in sync with the organisation and council. So Karen has, for the last 18 years, established a very vital institution there at Bendigo. She has recently moved to Canberra to be the director of the National Portrait Gallery, and through a future direction strategy is doing something similar. So I think we are advocates, obviously, for QV Mag, and with the new director who really came into the position simultaneously as I did, there has been an evolution of change which we are working through from the previous director and other personal assistants. So there's been a bit of a learning curve in certain areas, but we are overcoming those issues that we had initially. I'm very confident moving forward. The foundation has a strong place within the unit it works, and money will flow, I am sure, to various activities we put together. We also, too, are not just representing the ratepayers, and I think that's a keynote thing. because on the committee there are 5 committee members who actually live without or outside of Launceston City. But we are bringing funds into the city and attracting activities at QVMAG and particularly Royal Park. So I thank you very much for this afternoon, and we welcome you at our events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny, for that report, for your positive report. Thank you also to yourself and the time that you put in and the committee, the Arts Foundation. If you could pass on our thanks really to the work they're doing and for all the work they've done over many, many years. It's really appreciated, so thank you very much. We now move on to public question time. We have questions on notice, which are there, and then questions without notice. It's now time for public question without notice. There's none? I'll sit down.
At the last meeting, I did hear a comment from Councillor Mackenzie, who I do respect and admire, but that comment was about the award for the City Heart consultation process that Council received, and I'm sure it was well deserved. However, that theme does run through Council, particularly officers, that it was in effect anointing the process, and I believe that potentially the process has resulted in an intractable situation, particularly with the Brisbane Street Mall, that we're finding it very hard to effect any change, either minor or major. The document, Launceston City Heart, People, Places and Lifestyle, was voted on unanimously by Council, but at that time no document or no plan had been seen by any trader, landlord, member of the public, City Prom, Chamber of Commerce, and no single comment had been received on the document, as I understand it, whatsoever, and no document had seen the light of day. It was embargoed until it was released on the, I think it was the 10th of December 2015, and it was then voted on the following Monday at 1 p.m. and it was unanimously adopted. Is there some advice you can give that we can get past this document and the process? And I will ask, depending on the answer, another day about the revision F, the proof from this. Why could you see that there is a situation with council officers having been endorsed that this process was award-winning and isn't in any way leading to the intransigence that we are experiencing now with any change or comment on the Brisbane Street Mall, particularly, which was a major component of this?
Thank you. We've had a number of questions on this, and I've asked you to put down in writing, which I haven't seen yet, the list of all the things. Have we seen that yet from yourself?
Those were the suggested alterations from the traders?
Correct, yeah. Well, that goes along the line of the mall we're talking about.
Those particular items are the ones that we've exhausted, the flags, the statues.
Yeah, but I actually put it definitely in writing so then I could take it to the officers and follow through on it.
Well, they have been asking a question, Matt, thank you for that.
Yep.
It is not easy for an individual trader to shepherd the opinion of some 36.
Well, now you know the issue
traders.
we have with trying to work out the mall with all the traders, so, and the public.
Indeed, but the question is, where was the opportunity fitting into this potential $30 to $40 million worth of construction?
General Manager, if you can answer that.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. And we're certainly happy to meet offline and talk further about it. But with respect to the consultation process, so that was a co-design process that obviously developed the precursor work in terms of the parameters that we needed to inform the master plan that became ended up being designed for the mall. Now, that master plan was open for public consultation for some time and obviously came through a council meeting for endorsement. It was done and was implemented obviously with the full consultation with the retailers, of which you were one in terms of the group that had input into the actual implementation of the master plan. clearly there's more work that we can do and we want to do to be able to address the concerns that are being raised by various quarters within the community. And as the Mayor has just said, it's about getting a clear understanding about what that work is. And certainly we are open and wanting to hear from retailers or anyone in the community in respect of positive suggestions as how to improve the acceptability or the appropriateness of the mall. So.
I do appreciate that. So a follow-on question, just point of clarity. I said the 10th of December 2015 this was released. It was actually, I believe, the 18th of December 2015. But I will say again, as a second question, that no part I had not, and I'm not aware of any other trader that had seen any document from within this prior to it being released. That gave us 96 hours over a weekend to make comment on that.
The gentleman just answered that to the best of his knowledge for now. Look, we'll obviously answer anything else, take it on notice and follow up if we need to. He's agreed to have a meeting offline with you as well. So,
thank you. Comment then, could you imagine that there is some, and I don't know whether the word is resistance or pushback, or as genuine and earnest as the comment by Councillor Mackenzie was, that this was an award-winning process, it does make it somewhat challenging to raise an issue in this because of how it was regarded as being an award-winning process.
no, what? That's your opinion, and you can have that opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you, Mayor and Councillors. Ted Sands, Highgate Road, Kings Meadows. I want to raise an issue of, with your indulgence, Mayor, of a drainage problem across the road, across the property at 403 Glenwood Road. I first got involved with this about 2 years ago with Mr Badcock, who's I'm supporting here today. Mr Badcock allowed council to access his land to direct water from Glenwood Road across his property, across Mr Barry Peters' property and across the property of David Dixon's. Since the inception, there's been no follow-up or maintenance on this road. The inundation has impacted on the primary production of the land, and as I said, there are 3 landowners involved. It's now got to the stage where it's having a detrimental effect on Gordon and his wife Sue, and I'm seeking council's indulgence to review what's been written in the letter, and the letter's been forwarded to all the councillors, but to come up with a figure of $70,000 to correct a drain that council put in, I find absolutely staggering. So, in a nutshell, Mayor, what I'm seeking, and I'll be seeking this for some time, and as you know, Mayor, and you've said to me that I don't give up on stuff, and I've got some other personal details to deal with in my life that takes precedence over this, but seeing I've been batting on this for 2 years, I have no intention of giving up until I see it resolved, because I understand the drainage boundaries that the council have, but this is not a uniqueness that is outside the boundary of council's drainage area, because council initiated access to his land, Barry Peters' land and David Dixon's property to allow water off Glenwood Road to flood down to the...
Yeah, thank you, Mr Sands. We've understood the question and your comments. We'll take that on notice, I assume.
Thank you. And Mr Badcock will have a few words as well.
Yeah, as long as we ask the question, that's fine. It is question and answer. I've just given you 2 minutes, Mr Sands.
I'd like to thank you for giving me the time to put this forward. The council approached me about 25, 30 years ago about getting rid of the water, because Glenwood Road comes along and there's a hollow in the road. So if I hadn't given permission for the drain to go down through my property to drain down to the river, Glenwood Road would have gone underwater, because originally there was no drain or very little drain on Glenwood Road, and when it rained heavy, the water used to run across the road and down through my place over a long width. when they rebuilt Glenwood Road, they put table drain down the side, which you put all this water into one narrow strip. Of course, it's going to flood because the water can't get away quick enough. But with due respect to the person who put the drain in, had it been measured so that it never had a low spot in my place, the water would have got away and we wouldn't be here today.
Good. So the question?
The question is, the $75,000 bill, I nearly died. I've been digging dirt for years, and if they got an excavator in there, I'm sure they would have it done in a day. Excavator and a truck, you would shift this because it's only a dig here, dig there, just to get rid of the higher spot so the water can run away.
Okay, thank you, and we'll take that on notice as well. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the public? No, thank you.
There's something else I
No, sorry, no, your time's up now, thank you. So under the provisions of the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act 1993, Council acts as a planning authority in regard to items included in agenda item number 8. So number 8.1, 1A Georgetown Road. Somebody happy to move? Move, Councillor Spencer. Is there a seconder? Councillor Finlay. Do you wish to speak to it, Councillor Spencer? No, Councillor Finlay? No. Any councillor wish to speak? Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mayor. And having my concerns about Mowbray in general are that there is a limited amount of recreational space in the area. I know we have Heritage Park down the road, and the council's has worked towards having a precinct in the area that would be a recreational northern hub. But at the same time, this particular land that is zoned recreational at the moment, adjoining another bowls club that is recreational, adjoining the swimming pool site, or former swimming pool site, which the council own, which is also recreational, all backs onto the UTAS land, which I do believe has been earmarked, has been flagged as possible residential development in the future. Amongst other things, but especially that oval in the area towards Georgetown Road from the university. My concern is that at the moment, with those areas zoned recreational, it really does allow the possibility for more recreational space to continue in the Mowbray area. And if you think about Mowbray, there's no really big parks there. There's, you know, it's a densely populated area, a lot of young families, a lot of young students, but does seem to be bereft of recreational facilities. So after having looked at that and having, bearing in mind that, of course, the justification is that the houses adjacent to that are of a similar zoning, but at the same time, the area on the other side and behind that may well be more consistent with recreational and perhaps residential in the future, but we're not to know that yet. So I just feel like it may be a bit hasty for the council to make a decision on changing that recreational zoning. So that's my thoughts on the matter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Spencer, wish to close? I'll put the motion. Those in favour? Those against? That's one against. The rest are for. The motion is carried. Go to 8.2, 90 to 1110 Cemetery Street. Someone happy to move a motion? Councillor Finlay. Seconded Deputy Mayor. Councillor Finlay, wish to speak to it?
Thank you, Mayor. The item that we have before us today for clarification for the community in observing this decision, there was an initial development application for consideration by council, but this has been broken down into parts. So we're receiving today an application for a small parcel of land that fronts both Cemetery Street and Willis Street, and the application is to develop a permit around community meeting space, entertainment, food services, hotel industry, the construction of a bar and restaurant, a maker's workshop, an art gallery and a cafe. The first statement when considering development applications, and we often make this statement at the table, is that we have to tighten our commentary just to planning. But I think it's worth noting on this one particularly that the structure that we're dealing with today is probably one of the most stunning structures, light structures in Launceston, and so therefore needs to be protected in terms of the way we assess and apply the planning scheme to this item. And in that regard, the upgraded reports that we get list at the beginning of them those matters that the discretions occur, and the list is long. It's not necessarily long around discretion, but there are a number of elements of the assessment where there is no acceptable solution, so it has to go to that next layer. But for that reason, it did require quite a deep level of reading of all of the elements of the scheme against this, but ultimately it comes down to, for my mind, parking and materiality. So the parking issue has been addressed. It's important to note that the previous suggestion of developing a multi-storey car park on the lot isn't a part of this application, but the parking specifically for this, once amended, will meet the reasonableness of the offices, and that the materiality, again, once amended, will seem to be reasonable. So the consideration of this is that it does align with the requirements of the scheme. It's a significant development in what is developing as a significant precinct, and that it does meet the requirements of the scheme. It's worthy of support today.
Thank you, Councillor and Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Finlay has spoken with regard to parking and the significance of the project. This is another exciting day, Mayor, the opportunity to expand on what is fast becoming a mixed-use precinct, connectivity with our city park, and what is going to be a large thoroughfare into our student and cultural sporting precinct that is fastly developing. This is an exciting day. And the use being a gallery, a private gallery that's going to be open to the public, and facilities encompassing a bar and restaurant is so exciting. But most importantly for me, it meets the scheme and it meets the criteria. And I always gauge, whilst not fully, but like to see the response that comes from representations in the community. And this one only attracting one suggests that there's great support behind what could become a project that will continue to put us on the map. So I look forward to seeing it come to realisation and adding another thing for people to do in our great city.
Thank you very much. Any other speakers? Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mayor, and I certainly support the comments of Councillor Finlay and Deputy Mayor. And I'd just like to add that the creative use of part of our cultural heritage, part of our built heritage, is a fantastic thing. And although there was another part of this development that didn't meet those requirements, I look forward to seeing an amended version of that car parking that will complement the historical nature of the site. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Finlay, wish to close? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. Go to 8.3.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. So only residents and ratepayers or those on the City of Launceston electoral roll may address an item on the agenda. Before speaking, please state your name and address or property owned in Launceston. You may speak for up to 2 minutes. No extension of time is permitted. You must speak for or against the recommendations, not ask questions of councillors or council officers, nor attempt to enter into debate with councillors or council officers. Statements can only be made either directly relating to supporting the recommendation or arguing against it. Comments and statements are not to be defamatory, offensive or abusive, or be designed to embarrass any person, including councillors or council officers. Statements are not to be repetitive of statements or points already made. Several people speaking a common position should nominate a single speaker on their behalf. The Mayor may ask a member of the gallery to cease speaking if the above procedures are not followed. Following hearing the comments from the gallery, councillors will then consider the item.
Thank you, General Manager. Steve McKillop.
Good afternoon, Mr Mayor and councillors. Me and my partner Joanne Dunham are owners of Unit 3 and 4, 115A Hilton Road. We oppose the Airbnb application at 28 Olive Street because we have concerns for the access via the right-of-way for the new proposed driveway. We have 2 units renting out to Airbnb guests currently, which we've obeyed the regulations of the Launceston City Council by gaining a permit. But this garage at 28 Olive Street has been illegal from day one some years ago. Since early this year, we've put up with guests renting out the illegal garage, using our car park for units 1 to 4, and also coming up using that as a turning circle. Also infringing on the right-of-way access where they park in the makeshift roller door, making it narrow for our cleaners, guests and tenants for access. The proposed new driveway will not stop this, as a large number of Airbnb guests are tourists and have no idea where they're going. As soon as they hit the right-of-way driveway, the first thing they see is a car park with 4 spaces, and they directly drive up there and park. We've had a massive amount of inquiries from our guests when they arrive that there is no car park. We're concerned that if this gets passed today, this will restrict our access for our own guests and tenants. It states on the Launceston City Council website under visa and accommodation that the performance criteria must not impact owners and users of the right-of-way, Planning Directive number 6, and it also says impact on the safety and efficiency of local road network. We have queried issues if this is passed regarding a sealed driveway involving runoff, sprinkler system explanations. Our body corporate strata TAS also has objected, stating why can't the owner of 28 Olive use his own driveway up the south side of the main residence, which directly sets a path right to his garage for his tenants.
Yeah, thank you. Your time is up. Have you got much more?
About 30 seconds.
Oh, I'll allow it then.
The owner has disrespect policies for the Launceston City Council for some time. And to this day, he's still renting this out as Airbnb, as today the councillors left, guests arrived with their suitcases. Councillors, there have been some word for some time on Airbnb regulations. We've followed these from day one. Why penalise the ones that do the correct thing? The owner of 28 Olive hasn't. And what do you think is going to happen if this is passed today? The right-of-way will be hard to become lawful. And I just remind you of the visitor accommodation criteria stated on your website.
Yep, thank you. Thanks. Thank you. So we have item 8.3. Any councillor wish to move a motion? It'll be deemed approval.
Yes, that's right. So for the purpose of discussion and understanding the position of the table and the board.
Councillor Finlay moved. Is there a seconder? Councillor Harris? Councillor Finlay, you wish to speak to it?
Question first.
Question, yeah.
This morning on the bus trip it was suggested that there may be current activity on the site. My understanding is currently there's an order on the site for there not to be any current guests. Are there any provisions within the Act that would allow for us not to consider this item today if a current order on the site is being breached?
Director Hurst.
Thanks, Mayor. No, the separate sections of the Act, the development application that is before the council still has to be a decision, it still has to be determined, and enforcement of the planning scheme and under LUPA is a separate process.
Wish to speak, Councillor Finlay?
I will speak. And I thank the neighbour for their comments this morning in regards to the application. And as a member of the Planning Authority, what may actually happen today versus what might be happening of the behaviour of the property owner are two quite discrete things. The documentation before us recommends a permit be granted. The assessment via the scheme shows that there is a matter that needs to be resolved prior to use, which is the car parking to be provided. So actually, although it might take up my time, the question I asked before was slightly different. Can I ask a question now?
At the end of it, you're speaking, if you could.
So if the use can't occur until that happens, is there something under this Act that would allow, if it is being currently used?
Oh, you finished your time then?
No.
Well, just continue on and then we'll get that answer at the end.
You can answer that again. So the reality is that the scheme says that what has been requested practically as a planning matter is reasonable to approve. And I imagine that most people at the table, because nobody's spoken, or nobody jumped to move it, that this makes it tricky, because when you're dealing with practical matters of planning versus behaviour, they're two different things, and we can't manage behaviour with the planning scheme instrument. So that doesn't help the neighbour, where there are civil matters outside the provisions of the scheme that need to be resolved in a civil arena. Preventing someone from using parking in another area and making sure that access isn't limited by a potential future gate, making sure that the right-of-way driveway isn't blocked, are all behaviours beyond the assessment of the scheme. So I'm actually going to invite other councillors to share their thoughts on this, because the assessment against the scheme is reasonable. However, the behaviours appear to not align with the expectations of the scheme. And so my question remains, if there is being used but use can't commence until that happens, is there anything we can do about that? And what can we do to recommend to the neighbour about behavioural issues that don't align with the approval that may or may not be given today?
Thank you. Director Hurst.
Thank you, Mayor. If there is behaviour that is not in compliance with the paying scheme and the Act, we can pursue that compliance matter, which doesn't impact on the decision that needs to be made with respect to the development application. So we will absolutely follow up on that, and happy to engage with the neighbour around that.
Thank you. Councillor Harris.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, and thank you, all Councillor Finlay, for what she's presented, and it is a dilemma for us. The behaviours of the person, the owner of the property at 28 Oliver Street, is not what you would hope of a good neighbour. And certainly when I looked at the building, I wasn't impressed, because if you were trying to build a unit there, I doubt you'd be able to build it in its location as it is. However, we are retrospectively looking at applying a planning scheme to its particular building that's been used for purposes that was not intended. And unfortunately, under the Planning Act, I do find that we are bound to approve it, I think, based on the advice we've been given by the professionals. However, I would like to urge the owner of that property to perhaps become a better neighbour, and also instruct his tenants under Airbnb to not park outside it, because I would certainly be very annoyed if I was a tenant of or the owner of the right-of-way, and others were using it in a way that wasn't what a right-of-way is meant to be. A right-of-way is meant to be a cooperative thing to help out a landowner to access a piece of their property that wouldn't otherwise be able to gain access to it. And in this case, perhaps there was an alternative to run the driveway right through, but the right-of-way is there, and we cannot change that as a planning decision today. So I think, on balance, I will support this, but I really do find it's one of those ones we struggle with, because morally it's not quite as I would like it to be, but sometimes you've got to do what the Act says we've got to do. With that, I'll sit down.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. A great segue. Sometimes you've got to do what the Act says you've got to do. And unfortunately, on this occurrence, the applicant has decided to do nothing that the Act instructs them or our council procedures invites them to do. Thus, we see ourselves considering a retrospective application. Anyone who was part of the last couple of councils will know that, on principle, I am fiercely against supporting retrospective applications. It sets the wrong tone and tenor for development in our municipality and demonstrates to people that if you pay double the fee, you can get away with just about anything in our municipality. And in this instance, you can get away with doing it and still be used on the council list for work within our CBD. I would encourage the neighbour to call in on any day when people bringing suitcases into 28 Olive Street are observed. Whether that is day after day, I would encourage you to continue doing that so that we can, as the Director has suggested, follow a particular path of action, which is absolutely deemed appropriate in this instance. It is absolutely not the Launceston that we are wanting to create, to have people in temporary holiday accommodation that is not signed off, that is not approved and that is not compliant. And it is completely inappropriate for Dr Gunn to ask us to consider a development application when he is deliberately doing the wrong thing from a building compliance perspective. I, of course, understand the situation that our officers are in and respect the professional report that they presented and ordinarily would be in agreement to it. But I can't see in all consciousness how we can be approving something today when we know that the wrong thing is occurring, has occurred for a number of years, and by saying people can pay double the fees, they can get away with it. It sets the wrong message.
Thank you, Deputy. Any other speakers? Question, Councillor Walker?
Thank you, Mayor. I have a number of questions for our planning officers. Specifically, who owns the right of way? I'll just do one and let you answer if that's okay. Who owns the right of way, and why is it that 28 Olive Street should have access to that right of way? Is it because their property is on the boundary of that right of way? Or am I misunderstanding the nature of right of ways?
Apologies, Mayor. We just need to check a copy of the title so that we can accurately answer that question.
I'll get back to you on that one. Can you ask some other questions? Hopefully,
I can partly answer. I can partly answer it. In terms of how a right of way works, that the right of way will actually be identified on the title. What we're just checking is who the landowner is, which I think was part of the question.
Yep, thank you.
So you're telling me that 28 Olive Street has access to that right of way. Likewise, on the other side of that right of way, potentially where it's 26 Olive Street or whatever it is, might also have access to that right of way. Okay, then partly answers that question. I know that we have we're seeking retrospective approval of works that are being done, but of course there's quite a few other works that haven't yet been completed, which would include a sprinkler system, rearranging the parking bay that's associated with this dwelling. Can we just go through the things that are, these are all things that will have to be done before the approval is given, I presume. Final approval for use and that sort of thing.
Director Hurst.
Yes, those are things that will have to be completed and signed off on before legal use can occur. And as previously indicated, with regard to compliance as to any current use that might be occurring, our compliance officers will follow up on that.
Okay. Well, notwithstanding any further reply to my initial question about right-of-way, who owns the right-of-way and what rights other people have over that that are attached to their own properties, I suppose I'm wondering, like, could I use that right-of-way as a member of the public, or is it only property owners that could use it?
Property owners.
Notwithstanding that, I shall carry on, and I'll just make a statement if that's okay.
You want to speak now?
I wish to speak, Mayor.
Thank you.
Thank you. I can understand that if that parking bay that's associated with that dwelling was well signposted and very clearly attached to that property, that you might minimise the amount of confusion that the representative has alluded to. So I can see that there'll be some solutions there. What I have the most difficulty with is the fact that somebody owns this right-of-way, other people will be using this right-of-way, and yet it becomes a civil matter if they are to sort out who is actually responsible for the maintenance of that right-of-way. That's something I have difficulty with, as I suppose the Deputy Mayor elucidated a little earlier, that this is the sort of problems that we are creating when we start to look at retrospective approvals. So I suppose that first question that I asked was really aimed towards that. If we ascertain exactly who owns that land, and then we're essentially creating a civil issue that someone else has to resolve. And that is probably my biggest difficulty with this. I understand that's not our role to sort that out, but at the same time, I suppose this is what makes this decision very difficult insofar as we know that we're going to be creating an ongoing issue. I certainly understand that I think the parking issue could be solved. I think that if it was well signed and it was very clear, but even that we might not be able to stipulate, and that might cause further problems as well. On the balance of all that, I am struggling too, and I really appreciate hearing from other councillors, as I have done from the Deputy Mayor and from Councillor Finlay. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Harris has a question.
Yes, a question, if I may. Can you tell me what the penalty for using the property as an Airbnb prior to having planning approval is likely to be, and is it on a daily basis or otherwise, or whether it's just a... and do we end up in court, taking the owner to court to penalise them for ignoring the planning scheme? Just to give us an indication of what that might be.
Director Hurst.
Thanks, Mayor. I can't answer the question about what the penalty is without checking the Act. There is a process that we follow that includes showing cause. I would need to check to see whether we've already reached that point. I'm assuming that that's why the application's been put in, because we have already reached that point. The next step is to actually issue infringement, which brings with it a fine that carries... It's dependent upon the number of penalty points that's applied, but as I said, I don't have that information in front of me, so there is a process that eventually gets to court if it gets to that stage. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. Councillor Cox.
Thanks, Mayor. Look, I'd like to echo the Deputy's comments. This is one of those rock and a hard places you put us in, which you didn't put us in, but we're in. I have huge sympathy for the McKillops in this. I dislike intensely retrospective legislation of any shape or form. I totally agree with the Deputy. Quite often, no, sometimes, you'll get retrospective where there was a genuine mistake or something happened and we need to go back and fix it. I don't believe this is one of those. I believe this has blatantly been ignored by the owners of the property. I think the comments that were made by Mr McKillop about his property and how... I think their wishes are being totally disregarded in this instance. To suggest that we have a nice conversation with the owners. Good luck with that. I reckon you've probably tried that before. To put up a no parking sign, yeah, it might work, may not. I find us in a very unenviable situation. Short-term accommodation, I'd be really interested, and no one here can tell me, so I won't make it a question, I'll just put it as a part of a comment. I would love to know if they've got insurance for their short-term accommodation, because having dealt with it, I know how hard short-term accommodation is to get, what insurance is to get. So, not alluding one way or the other, I'd just be interested to know if they got it and where, because a lot of people would like to get it. So I totally support what the Deputy said. I have sympathy for the McKillops, and again, I just think that the owners of this property have just treated the whole process with disregard, not in the short term, but over a long period of time.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. Have you got an answer? Oh, thanks. Richard?
So the land on which the right-of-way is situated is owned by the property at the rear, 115A Elford Road, the Strata Corporation. The title at the front, owned by Mr Gunn, has a benefiting right-of-way over that. So he's entitled to drive his cars up and down that right-of-way. It's not unusual around Launceston for that situation to occur, and from time to time there are civil issues, but that's the nature of rights of way.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Question, Deputy Mayor.
With regard to point 9, amenity, it says the ongoing use of this site must not adversely affect the amenity of the neighbouring properties. Notwithstanding the outstanding professionalism of this report and the way that the final recommendation has been arrived at, what regard for that particular clause do we have in terms of the use, the current use, which is obviously illegal, but the future use, all things being compliant, with regard to not adversely affecting the amenity of the neighbouring properties?
Director Hurst?
Thanks, Mayor. This is a standard condition that applies, and it generally allows for the nuisance type impacts on amenities. So, as indicated here, noise, odour, that kind of thing, and the test of that is really dependent upon the particular issue that's been brought to the attention, and is generally dealt with under other legislation such as the Environmental Protection Act. And
Councillor Soward.
Thanks, Mayor. And I, like others that have spoken, I enjoy a significant amount of sympathy for Mr McKillop for what he shared with us. I just want to, obviously won't repeat what's been said by the Deputy Mayor and Councillor Cox and I think Councillor Walker. On page 78, when we get into the visitor accommodation, it talks about what visitor accommodation must do and things that it shouldn't do and where it relies on performance criteria. I take a slightly broader view. When we look there, it says, under the performance criteria, it says visitor accommodation must be compatible with the character and use of the area and must not cause an unreasonable loss of residential amenity, having regard to the privacy, any likely increase in noise, the scale of the use, and so forth. So this, for me, Mr Mayor, it is one of those tricky ones, where I guess our officers have looked professionally and looked how it's complied on paper, which it has. Where the challenge lies for me, and obviously others from their remarks, if the owner was following what it said on paper, then no problems. No problems, because it would be doing that what it says. It must be compatible with the character and must not cause an unreasonable loss of residential amenity. Mr Mayor, listening to Mr McKillop's remarks, I reckon he'd be suffering a fair loss of residential amenity, and he's talked about and shared with us some examples of how that has impacted on his tenants in their homes. And again, something they don't deserve. They deserve to have their residential amenity protected. So I'm not going to support this based on that. Of course, as I said, and I'll make this very, very clear, what our officers have got there and what they've measured, if the owner of this property complied with what's written there, absolutely, absolutely. But what we're seeing from the actions is that that's actually not taking place. So I'm not satisfied that if we approve this, that the residential amenity on those that live on those units that Mr McKillop's described will be impacted, and I believe that they will. And I guess the other thing, Mr Mayor, and whilst this is probably more broadly a broad remark rather than directly assessing the application, I remember around this table many, many times in the last few years, particularly the last 3 or 4 years, where there has been a growth in those Airbnb and type properties, that it's been mentioned by some previous councillors and some on this council about concerns they have where people don't do the right thing. And, you know, I'm really concerned that we've got that going on, because you know, we've seen in other jurisdictions in other countries and other parts of Australia where things have gone down that have been really, really unfortunate, sometimes resulting in injury and or death. And then when the coroner does their results and their case and everything, you know, all of a sudden we find that the people are staying in buildings that aren't fit for the purpose or registered or approved or whatever. So that's just a concern that I have on a broader sense, but I won't be supporting it.
Thank you. General Manager wishes to comment.
Just thought it important to clarify in terms of the assessment that you're being asked to make today. It is against the planning scheme as has been laid out in the report there today. It's not a relevant consideration to be taking the compliance or lack of compliance in terms of the history of the site as a determinant of your decision in respect of whether or not it complies with the planning scheme. It's not something that is actually able to be considered in terms of the assessment that's been made and the conditions that are recommended in front of you today. So it's just important that you have to separate the two in terms of your planning authority obligation.
Thank you, General Manager. Councillor Dakin has a question.
Thank you, Mayor. My question might be redundant after those comments from the General Manager, but a really quick one. How long has this been trading as an Airbnb, do we know? And there's reasons why I ask that.
Director Hurst? Richard? No?
We don't have an exact figure on that, but it could be 6 months.
Okay.
And correspondence has been had between council officers and the owner, which has resulted in this application.
Okay. Thanks. I suppose with my experience and history with Airbnbs, accommodation and parking, in July 2018, Airbnb put in a stipulation to use their platform. You had to have council permission or council permit. So just interested in what date that was. The statement, right, mate? Yes, speak. Thank you. Parking. Again, I've got experience with car parks. I've got one myself. It's attached to accommodation. It's very frustrating. You cannot control where people park. You especially cannot control our fantastic visitors onto the island where they park. And they'll park over driveways, they'll park where they're not to park. They're just excited to be here. Parking, as I said, you can't control it. But today here, we have an opportunity that we can control. So, thank you.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Finlay, wish to close.
Thank you, Mayor. It's one of those days where you could insert all sorts of adjectives, but I'll go with a reasonable one in case it gets picked up, which is we can have, you know, smooth days here and we can have really hard days. And today's one of those really hard days because we've got an instrument, which is the looper, and we've got a responsibility and we have to match them in. And to complete the task that we're given today, they're the only things that we actually legally can do today. What it means is that we have a member of the community that is impacted by another member of the community, and if we make a decision that's consistent with the Act today, that's likely to continue, and that doesn't feel okay. There's a couple of things that's important here to clarify in the role of council, and that is if somebody lands a development application at our door, we have to receive it. We can't refuse it. When it gets assessed, it's under a time frame. We have to do it within a certain period of time. And if there's discretions or a certain number of representations, our own internal policy has got to come to the table. So it's with us today. When you read the assessment of the application, it complies or is consistent on every item that it's considered against. That doesn't help how it feels, but it's the reality of what we're dealing with today. The Mayor made a comment at the beginning of this item where there were crickets at the table on who was going to move it, and that is that there's another really important element of being a planning authority, and if we don't make a decision in the time frame, the item's deemed approved as of right, and then it'll go to, someone else will then make that decision. And so if we don't act today, it'll get approved. If we act today against the reasonable measures of the scheme, then we're likely to be taken to appeal, and it's unlikely that it would stand up. That doesn't feel great, but they're sort of like, that's our job. And so today's a hard day. I've always been someone that's a process person, and it's hard not to make a decision consistent with the processes that we have before us. And with planning, and this comment I make is often in the opposite direction, so again, this doesn't sound great, but planning's about the property and not the person. So we make this decision today or any decision and it changes hands tomorrow, the decision remains. So there could be a fantastic person that operates this site in the future that is a good neighbour. So it's actually easy to vote against it, and someone like me that will vote for it because it's a process thing then looks like it's not very nice. The hard thing to do today that's consistent with our organisational responsibilities and the requirements of the scheme is to approve it, and that's not fantastic. Apologies for the role and the position that we're in.
Thank you, Councillor Finlay. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. Those against? 3-6.
We need a reason there.
Yeah, we need a... motion on the grounds for refusal.
Yeah, we need to have some direction.
Still need to have a direction of what the grounds are. Deputy, you going to move?
Mayor, I'd like to move that we instruct officers to work with us to provide some reasonings that are able to withstand planning rationale with regard to...
Well, Richards has got a suggestion.
Thank you.
No. See whether you're happy with that.
CNF. So scale and use. Scale and use and capability. Scale and use. So, Mayor, I'd just like to take this opportunity to see if we could work together to create this. It's with regard to the area that I intimated and others such as Councillor Soward mentioned. So, that the application be refused on the basis that the planning authority is not satisfied that the proposed use can operate without adversely impacting the amenity of nearby residential uses. The proposed use is determined to not comply with P1 of Planning Directive number 6, visitor accommodation, specifically C, the scale of the use and its with surrounding characters and uses within the area, and F, any impact on the owners and users right of way.
Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Walker, thank you. Do you wish to speak to it all? Deputy Mayor?
Well, I'd like to, first of all, seek that the General Manager would be happy to sign off on that based on his ability to
he's nodding.
complies. Look, I just want to say that I certainly appreciate what Councillor Finlay has said, and from a process perspective, what people are observing is clunky. There's no doubt about that. But I think the motion says a lot about the application that is before us and its intended compliant use.
Thank you. Councillor Walker?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. And I too would like to say that I appreciate Councillor Finlay's approach in wanting to stick to the process and a process-driven decision, but I also appreciate the fact that it was Councillor Soward who, pointed out to us that, in actual fact, that our concern does centre around this amenity and how this property would be used. I will sort of, I'll take some umbrage with the Deputy Mayor who described this as a clunky process. Is that the word you use, clunky? I think in a sense this elucidates the situation that we're in, that we find ourselves in when someone does push the process to its limits in doing works that aren't approved, in not necessarily communicating clearly with their neighbours, and this is all the things that have been brought to the table today. So in actual fact, I actually think the process is working well when we might be struggling with a decision, but that's what we're entrusted to do, and that's what we've done right here. This doesn't preclude the fact that this might eventually be approved. It might eventually be approved by us. It might be appealed. All these things we'll wait and see. But it does give the opportunity for the proponent to have a good look at what they're doing and how they're going about doing it, and maybe approaching this in a different way. So I would encourage the proponent, as well as those who are objecting, to now go forward, with a little bit of creativity and optimism and goodwill, and we might find that some of the objections and problems that are created when people do take these things into their own hands might disappear. And I wish the process well and the people involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Finlay?
Thanks, Mayor. I feel comfortable that I was able to articulate previously the position of council and thank the officers for their recommendation. However, with the numbers at the table to support the refusal, I stand with the balance of the councillors to support this. It will be a step in a process, but it demonstrates our support to the community when they have concerns around uses in the community.
Councillor Soward?
Thanks, Mayor. And focusing on the angle I took when I spoke earlier and looking at the language up there with what we're talking about now, when representatives come to the council in matters like this, they talk about what might happen. They talk about what might happen if we approve something, what might happen. What we're dealing with in this, Mr Mayor, isn't what might happen, it's what's happening. It's what's been happening, it's what's happening, and whilst obviously we don't know the mind of what the future will hold, it would be reasonable to assume it may continue to happen. So I'm very, very comfortable with this, and I'll be supporting it.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Deputy Mayor, wish to close?
Oh, just briefly, I want to say that what's clunky about it from my perspective is it's obviously not good governance for councillors to be coming up on the spot with words that haven't been tested and ran through the lens that is professional advice. So I want to say it's nothing clunky about officers, it's clunky about the operation of how we've taken a professional recommendation and that has been presented to us with all the facts, and this is in no way a reflection on that or the professional advice that we've been provided, but what's clunky about it is that the Deputy Mayor is making up and moving a motion on the spot. So in terms of clunkiness, that stands. But what I say is that we have a motion that, in terms of all of the comments in the previous consideration, I think is reflected in what we've ended up with, and I thank the officers for helping us with that. And I think, in all honesty, what this does is, of course, opens the opportunity for the applicant to correct and move forward with some of the items that potentially have influenced us to get to this point into the future.
Thank you, Deputy. I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. We now no longer sit as a planning authority. That's our Mayor's announcements. So I do want to just first of all say that on the 29th of October I did not attend the Turf Club AGM, as it's noted there, if you can take that out. Thank you. And I do want to mention a couple of things. I was really thankful to Shane and the team who were involved with the West Hamer Primary School when they came for the Work Discovery Day. That was a fantastic day, challenge, an opportunity, and it was great for the young people to be able to hear from our staff and to have that one-on-one. So thank you to the team for doing that. But also on the Saturday the 19th, it was great to go to the New Horizons Club, and on behalf of Council, say a few words for the opening of their project, which was the backyard, which had been developed by the Rotary Club of Launceston. Great project, absolutely fantastic. If you haven't been to New Horizons recently and seen what they've done in the backyard, it's absolutely amazing and fantastic. The Rotary Club went well beyond, and we put some funds into that as well, by the way. We had some contributions towards that, but the Rotary Club put a lot more in, but they also put their time into it and made it better than what even the New Horizons were expecting. So it's an absolutely amazing space, and well, congratulations to the Rotary Club who do, not just that club, but all the clubs that do a wonderful job in our community. And it was really pleasing on the Saturday the 26th to go to Kid I Am and officially open Kid I Am at the Silver Dome. It was people everywhere, fantastic. And what I love about the Kid I Am program is over 70 I think it was, 70 different things that young people could do and experience, which they probably hadn't tried before, whether that's riding a little bike or whether that's playing softball, trying softball, or whether that's basketball, football, netball. No, just about everything was there in sports, but also activities for kids, and schools were there and learning about different ways of education. So absolutely amazing event for our city. So congratulations to the organisers, and it was a pleasure to be able to be involved in that, and I know quite a number of the councillors would have gone there on the day. Those were children and would have thoroughly enjoyed it. I saw many smiling faces of the young ones while I was there, and they were having a ball. So it was really great. That's it from myself. Thank you. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Whoops. Nearly forgot, didn't I? Congratulations to ourselves. It's unusual to have to do that, but the City of Launceston got recognised through the Australian Beautiful Awards, Tasmania, Sustainable Communities Awards, Certificate of Recognition, and most exciting, we had 16 awards, so it's not just one or two, but we had 16 awards on the day, which was fantastic. But we won the 2019 Sustainable Cities Award. So the 2019 Sustainable Cities Award was won by this council. So really congratulations to General Manager and to all the staff that were involved and those who have played a part over many years. So it's a certificate and a trophy, whatever you want to call it. So it's fantastic. So well done. So really pass on my thanks to, again, all those involved, and it shows you what a leader this council is in our community. Thanks for that. I nearly did forget. Okay, we go to councillor reports. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. I rise today to celebrate the achievements of one of the City of Launceston's staff members who has been recognised in the Australian Human Rights Commission's annual awards. Natalie Savant has been announced as an individual award finalist. There were over 350 nominations from right around Australia, and now Natalie is one of 5 finalists up for the Human Rights Award, which will be announced in Sydney on the 13th of December. With over a decade of work in the human rights area, including social inclusion and resilience building within our Launceston community, Natalie is an outstanding role model. Her community programs, such as the Breatho program, the Racism It Stops With Me campaign, the Lock It or Lose It safety campaign, the Fair Trade at City of Launceston, and of course the award-winning Launceston Human Library are all elements of her recognition as an award finalist. She does a plethora of work, and over my 7 years on the Launceston Safer Communities Partnership, it was a pleasure to work with her, and we wish her well as she represents Tasmania and herself and this organisation in early December at the announcement of the National Awards.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor. Councillor Harris? Yes, thank you.
Also, just to note a couple of attendants of a common theme, along with yourself and a couple of other councillors, Mackenzie and Gibson, and I think that was all, and Daking. We attended the launch of Sally's Ride last Thursday. Sally's Ride's in its 11th year. My own Rotary Club is organising it, and it's good to see that Councillor Daking and Mackenzie are participating. And I encourage any of the other councillors sitting around the table that the 10-kilometre ride is suitable for anyone who can walk, basically. As long as you have a bike, you can ride the 10-kilometre one. So Sunday the 1st of December. To continue that theme, on Saturday night we attended a number of us attended the Launceston Chamber of Commerce Business Awards, and on my table was the Outstanding Visitor Experience winner, and that was On Your Bike Tours. And I'd like to congratulate the operators of that. It certainly was a great night, 430 people in the Grand Chancellor, and it just filled me with hope for the city that there are many fantastic businesses out there doing a great job, and it is wonderful to recognise them all. And it does fill me full of hope for the future. And finally, to complete the bike scenario, I attended the e-bike expo on Sunday at Royal Park, and are now actively considering whether I'll buy myself an e-bike as well. Certainly the ability of Launceston to ride around the hills, an e-bike makes an incredible difference, and I think it could well be part of our solution. And so perhaps I'll be one who put their money where their mouth is. And again, I'd invite others to consider doing the same. And finally, I did enjoy a very good function with the farewelling City of Launceston long-term employees, or most of them are long-term employees, on Tuesday night here at a function to see 34 years of experience in someone like Andrew Gall, who I've known almost all of that time. Was fantastic to recognise his service and all of the others to this city, because they certainly have gone above and beyond just the normal 9 to 5 almost in every case. So it was a fantastic event. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Finlay.
Thanks, Mayor. Wanted to report back on my attendance in Adelaide last week of the Asia Pacific Creative Cities Conference on behalf of Director Hurst. It was really eye-opening to see how a creative network, a global creative network, can provide support in both directions, where there's a knowledge exchange and an ideas exchange between cities that all recognise that culture and creativity is driving economic prosperity. There were people from developed and developing countries, from the States, from all of the Asia-Pacific regions and from Europe there in attendance. As we go down our journey of our cultural strategy, of all of the other layers of the city deal, there's no doubt that recognising that will continue to be important. Although I did get myself in trouble a couple of times when and many of us do this, including us as a city do this, where we always race to find the economic value of a creative activity. And a lot of the conversation there was saying there's absolutely that. There's the benefits. The panels that we were part of were about promoting cultural and creative development, but through employment, trade and investment. It was about cooperation, but it was also around tourism, policies and strategies, around developing resilience in a community through creativity and culture, but also around entrepreneurship, ideas and innovation. But there were, in every conversation, that layer to say, acknowledging the role that culture plays as a creative and as a behavioural environment is equally important, if not more important. So I look forward how we as a community, as a Greater Launceston community, grapple with that idea that food around that sort of creative culture element that we're going down with food, how it connects people and how by connecting people through food we can create and lift the sort of capabilities of the community. There'll be a lot more work on that as we come, but being able to attend and get the benefit of that and making the contacts there, I think was really valuable. Just earlier today, Bendigo and Ballarat, who were also in attendance, who are also going down this path, have just received their designations. So that's positive, hot off the press. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Finlay. Any other councillor reports? Any questions from councillors? No? We move on to council workshop. Somebody happy to move council work? Councillor Finlay. Is there a seconder? Councillor Harris. Wish to speak to it all? Councillor Finlay? Councillor Harris? Any councillor wish to speak to it? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. We now move down to 19.1, budget amendments. Moved Councillor Finlay, seconded Councillor Soward. Any want to speak to it? No, Councillor Soward?
To note, Mr Mayor, it's a process that happens from time to time, as it says in the documentation there. The budget amendments are changes to the statutory elements which require a council decision, and the changes relate to external grant revenue and transfers between operations and capital projects. So again, important part of the transparency that council does. It mentions that it requires an absolute majority of council in accordance with the section 82(4) of the Act, and it spells out there clearly in the recommendation what we're doing. So for the benefit of those listening at home, we approve the following changes to the budget. The net increase in revenue from external grants and contributions of $692,962. The increase in revenue from operations, external grants and contributions of $139,300. The net increase in operations expenditure of $248,124. The increase in operations expenditure from operations, external grants and the contributions of $139,300. The net increase in capital works expenditure from external funds of $692,962. The net decrease in capital expenditure of $248,124. And the council notes the amendments from item 1 result in an operating surplus being amended to $7,225,248, including the capital grants amount, and the capital budget being increased to $28,778,538. The reason I did read those out, as I said, obviously there'd be people listening, but I guess just to also show the strong position the council's in, and again, the very transparent nature of what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Thank you, Councillor Soward. Any other speakers? Deputy Mayor.
I couldn't miss the opportunity to say, of course, I understand the reasoning as to why the Graham Murphy exhibition isn't going ahead, but just to note that, you know, as someone who initiated and worked hard in the early stages of that, it is understandable, but still disappointing.
Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Finlay wish to close? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. 19.2, General Manager's report on adjustments. Move Councillor Finlay, seconded Councillor Soward. Councillor Finlay, you wish to speak to it? Councillor Soward? Any councillor wish to speak to it? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. 20.1, progress against the annual plan. Councillor Finlay move. Thanks for coming. And second to Councillor Soward. You wish to speak to it, Councillor Finlay?
Only to say that this item, when it comes to council periodically, is always really useful and important, but as it's the first one through the year, it's early days.
Councillor Soward?
Yeah, just to echo Councillor Finlay's remarks, but to also add, I guess, a frustration. Often those who come for the early 10 minutes of the meeting don't hang around to hear the stuff at the end, and this is an example of what we're doing and how we're progressing things, as were the previous items.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor Finlay wish to close? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. 20.2, Launceston Flood Authority. Annual report for approval. Who would like to move that? Councillor Harris, thank you. Is there a seconder? Councillor Finlay. Councillor Harris, wish to speak to it? Councillor Finlay. Any councillor wish to speak to it? I'll put the motion. Those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. That is carried. We now have a motion to go into closed council. That is recorded there on our notes. Move Deputy Mayor, second to Councillor Dakin. All those in favour, please raise your hand. And that is all councillors present. So we now go into closed council. Thank you.
Pause during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio streaming of today's council meeting starts at 1 p.m.
So now we've got a motion in open that it's there, the item. Who's happy to move? Councillor Finlay is happy to move that. Seconded Councillor Soward. All those in favour? That's all, councillors. That's carried. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We'll close the meeting.
The meeting starts at 1 p.m. local time. Streaming is paused during breaks. Audio